Okay, we are live. So welcome to our audience in their homes, and welcome to Grace, Colleen, and Samia, who are our speakers tonight. Thank you guys so much for agreeing to speak on this important topic. I think we all have seen that it's been a very busy week for the early childhood development sector, and I think this is a very relevant conversation right now. So we're very excited to have you. Just for everybody who hasn't attended one of our events before, we are the Education Fish Tank. We're a group of education enthusiasts who all have day jobs in the education sector, but outside of work, we like to organize relevant conversations on important topics. And so, yeah, we usually organize events about once every month or so. So, yeah, although with COVID, obviously things have been a little bit chaotic recently. So tonight's conversation is on COVID and early childhood development. And we have three speakers who are very well qualified to speak on the topic. So just to give you a little bit of background on our speakers, we have Colleen Daniel Fortwell, who is a mother of four and one son with Down syndrome. Colleen has been an activist in the sector and has really helped to establish an early childhood development center that was working on Down syndrome before that was something that was accessible for people in South Africa broadly. She's also the chairperson of the Mitchell's Plain Education Forum, and early childhood development is her passion, and she really does show that in all of her engagements. We also have Samia Hendricks, who's an analyst at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Samia has been involved as a program coordinator for ASRI, a course administrator for Numeric, and also has a master's in social business and microfinance from Glasgow Caledonian University. And lastly, but not least, we have Grace Matlape. Grace is the CEO of Smart Start, an early learning social franchise set up in 2015, which is the focus of Smart Start is to deliver early learning to 3 to 5-year-old children. Grace has worked in the social justice sector for many years, initially in the mental health field, and more recently as the program director and then CEO of Love Life. So yeah, we have a wonderfully qualified panel, and we're really excited to have you all with us to speak about this topic. The format of the event is going to be that every speaker is going to have a brief opportunity to speak to the topic of COVID-19 and ECD, and then we're going to pass over for questions and responses and more dynamic conversation from there. But to get us started, Colleen, if you would be willing to share your thoughts on this moment with us.
Okay, good evening all, and thanks for the vote of confidence. I'm very nervous tonight, but I'm going to start off and say that so much has been said or challenged or written by many regarding the ECD sector arena and the reopening of ECD sites. So tonight, I just wanted to paint a picture of what we have in this arena, and I would like to state that we have privileged society demanding the reopening of ECD sites, poor society scared of the reopening as they've had no income for many months, yet need to open as the passion for our children in lockdown for 3 months overtakes the emotions of fear, anxiety, and no money. To recap the history of ECD, early childhood development, we have brilliant policies and a Children's Act which works in the favor of all children as well as protecting their rights. Yet the implementation of these policies by government has failed our children miserably. COVID-19 has exposed many inequalities in our systems in so many sectors, but more so evident in the field of young children, which is my passion. Since lockdown, ECD received no mention from government except on the 26th of May, when National Department of Social Development engaged with civil society on the reopening of ECD sites. 8 work streams were set up and contributions to the document now circulating the ECD arena was the result of the work streams input. This has created anxiety as ECD sites are now fearful as to where the money is going to come from to reopen the ECD site in terms of the PPE. Remember, these ECD sites had no income for 3 months. Teachers were not paid as well. And the UIF TERS has not really addressed the inequalities of practitioners' salaries in the sector, where some earn less than 1,000 Rand per month, or where ECD sites did not contribute to UIF, leaving many practitioners without an income. I also just want to mention that the SOP, the Standard Operating Procedures, which is now in the arena, is a document of 69 pages that ECD managers have to work through before they can reopen. A tremendous task, but that's a debate for another day. So let's address the children being in lockdown for 3 months. One day they were at creche, and the next day they were confined to their home with their family and are still at home. Children learn through play, and they do this best when they have the freedom of choice to play and explore. Most parents are working from home and having to do a job as well as manage their children. And whilst they have the best interests of the children at heart, they're not always skilled or equipped to deal with the developing child of this age cohort, a critical period of brain development and setting our foundations for future learning. So let's look at the current situation. Parents need to go back to work and need their children to be back at ECD sites. ECD sites need to open but lack resources or finances to reopen as a COVID compliant site. Government supports registered ECD sites with a subsidy, and the poorest that need the subsidy cannot access this as they do not meet the criteria for registration. Think about the reality of where we live and of our poor communities. Most are shack dwellers or live in the RDP houses, yet the need for ECD services are needed in these communities. Will they ever meet the requirements to become registered in terms of the bylaws and many other challenges? I am not advocating that we must forego the criteria, but we need to find a way to balance the setup and give funding to where it is needed most, our poor communities. Many registered ECD sites receive funding from DSD and they do not need that support as they are able to charge fees to meet the expense budget. Research has shown that children in this age cohort are not vectors of the disease, but we must also be mindful of our country and its high risk of HIV, TB, and malnutrition amongst our children, as well as children who suffer with severe asthmatic conditions. And as this is a fluid situation, can we go on overseas research? Practitioners at ECD sites are the experienced goggles of 60 plus with comorbidities. Will we be putting them at risk when we open? When we crunch numbers from the stats given all the time, there are 6.5 million under the age of 6. And in this cohort, 2.5 million attend ECD sites, while about 60% of this total are in economically challenged communities. And we will be leaving them behind if the demand to reopen on the 6th of July happens. Department of Basic Education and Department of Social Development has also created confusion around this date. The grade R classes at schools under the ambit of the Department of Basic Education will open, as well as ECD sites who have grade R at the ECD site and receives a subsidy by the Department of Education, they have to reopen. This has created conflict within the ECD sector as well. So let's think this through and see how can we support what is happening. ECD sites need to reopen. That's the reality. Our children are at risk. However, government and our Minister of Social Development needs to start showing leadership and take the process forward of ensuring that all ECD sites reopen with a start-off budget of 20K and a subsidy for 6 months. This will probably cost government a mere 1.5 billion if we base it on 40,000 ECD sites. So government's always saying they have no money, yet they gave the taxi industry 1.3 billion And COVID has shown how they could raise 500 billion. So we're saying stop the bailouts of our parastatals and give the money to our ECD sector. They are our future. And I need to remind you of what Oliver Tambo once said. If we do not look after our children, we do not deserve our future. Wise words that fall on deaf ears. In yesterday's presentation of a mini budget, the minister makes mention of about 7,000 ECD sites that they will assist on reopening and talks about an 89 million budget that was available in the DSD budget for infrastructure, which they are redirecting to COVID for reopening with a standard support package for the site. How many sites do they intend reaching with this money? Will it be the registered sites or the poor sites? Minister, we call upon you now more than ever to put your voice behind ECD. Our children and practitioners are depending on you now to make the wise move and give guidance on the way forward for all ECD sites. If we do not respond, we are going to be responsible for many ECD sites closing and practitioners becoming unemployed, which will be an added burden on the state. Thank you so much for allowing me to share my opinion on what's happening in the ECD arena.
Thank you for that, Colleen. That was really beautifully put. And as we can see from chats, I think the people watching agree. Yeah, so that was a very impassioned speech, and I think very well articulated, Colleen. Can I pass over to Grace to add your thoughts into the mix? I think your mic is still
really
muted.
Wonder. Thank you. Good evening, and thank you very much for having me this evening. I wonder really how much different opening statements are going to be, because we all live exactly the same reality that has just been very eloquently described by Colleen. Three things come to mind to me when I think about ECD within the context of COVID-19. The first thing is that what we've just done in the last 3 months is let children down. I was listening to a comment by Mia Malan yesterday, where she was giving a really great analysis of how epidemics have a way of exposing weaknesses in systems. And that's what we have seen with ECD during COVID-19, that this is already a very fragile system, which in fact, if we had given it proper thought in advance, had realized that, we would have realized that it qualifies as an essential service. Within an environment that has particularly high levels of child abuse and inadequate child care facilities, how could we expect that during lockdown and with children of essential health and other workers, that childcare will not be compromised? We have a high level of children who are malnourished in South Africa. And we continue to let them down because we did very little to make sure that during the lockdown, that the one guaranteed meal that children could get would continue to be accessible to them. So we really did have a situation of complete destituteness and lack of protection of a rather fragile sector. The second thing that comes to mind is about a very fragile workforce, which in my view is hanging on by the skin of their teeth. I'm not going to repeat the statistics that Colleen has already shared, but what we know is that the entire burden of ECD in South Africa is on the social sector, and that what is worse, the rapid survey that was conducted earlier that Samia will probably talk a little bit more about, and so I won't go into, showed that this inequity it translates into an informal sector that is having to cope with the burden of an underfunded, under-recognized, undervalued service in South Africa. What was discovered, what was found in that rapid survey is that more than 60% in coverage, probably significantly more than 60% of the current early learning coverage is in the informal sector. So I'm not surprised when we are even put in a position where we end up comparing support or lack of support of ECD with support of a taxi service, which itself was not receiving and is not receiving adequate support. So with the informal sector, it means none of the small business support that was put in place during the COVID-19, or very, very little of it, is going to fall through to the poorest proportion of the ECD providers in South Africa. The third thing that really concerns me about ECD at this time is Smart Start was set up specifically to look at establishing a delivery mechanism that will enable sustainable, affordable, quality access to ECD, particularly for children who are excluded from access in South Africa. And so the biggest concern I sit with is what proportion of this essential service will be there when reopening is finally announced. Because there has been no mechanisms for supporting the sector during lockdown. Reopening support is absent, continuing the culture of compliance rather than support and development of children. In the last 3 months, children have been excluded from proper stimulation. Parents have had very little communication about what it is that they can expect from government. What the sector needs right now is strong leadership that will ensure that we do not waste a good crisis that the COVID-19 pandemic is, and that we innovate our way out of this, and that we finally find a way to put children right at the center of early learning, not mechanisms of compliance that do not seem to have any relevance to the reality of the lives of children in the communities that they find themselves in. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Grace. I think the words that I'm hearing quite consistently are around the sector being relatively under-recognized and not considered an essential service because it's part of the informal economy. And I think that's an interesting theme to discuss as we go forward. But can I hand over to Samia for your perspective?
Thanks so much. The nice thing about being last is that I can say everyone's covered my points, so I'm not going to speak for too long, which is in fact the case. So yeah, no, thanks so much for having me, and thanks to the colleagues that went before me. There's 3 things that I just want to touch on. I think, as mentioned, a lot of the points have been touched on already. I just wanted to start off by touching on the report that Mum Grace had mentioned. So ourselves, in conjunction with her organization, Smart Start, Ilifala Bantwana, SA Congress, Bridge, and other organizations that were part of the initiative, we did this massive survey of over 9,000 ECD practitioners, and we want to understand really the extent to which COVID was having on the ECD workforce. And one of the stats in there shows that 68% of operators were worried about reopening, that they wouldn't be able to reopen owing to the strain that the lockdown had on them. And I was actually helping to code a lot of that data. And, you know, that 68%, to classify people in that 68%, we were only looking at responses that said, you know, absolutely sure, we really don't think we're going to open. Anyone that was maybe, you know, unsure about whether they'd be able to open or not, we didn't even include them in that 68%. So, I wanted to cite that because it really shows, you know, the extent to which people are worried about the impact that this crisis is going to have on their reopening. And yeah, so that's one of the points I want to make. And I think what that really speaks to, that's something Mom Grace mentioned, was the fact that, COVID has given us a mirror into our society and into our sector, like it has for many other sectors. And I don't think we like what we're seeing, especially the depth of crisis when it comes to unregistered ECD services. And although it has been a long-standing issue, it's really about trying to use this time to see how do we address this, because we see such momentum from both the state at all levels to really try to address this issue and other issues that we're seeing in other sectors, which really brings me to the point around registration. Registration is a significant issue. It's something that in any forum that you organize around ECD, it's always an issue that that comes to the fore. And we finished data mapping work in April that we did in the Bizana local municipality with assistance of Impanda South Africa. And from the 248 ECD centers in that municipality, only 27% of them were registered. So, that really just speaks to the depth of the crisis and the extent to which, registration is really an issue in the sector. And even around issues of sanitation, we speak often around, thanks, to the likes of equal education, sanitation is very much on the agenda when it comes to schools, but not so much when you talk about the ECD sector. That particular data mapping work that we did, we found that from 224 ECD sites, 133 of them had pit latrines, had pit toilets. And, these are really small kids. So if we're worried about pit latrines for schools, we should be concerned even more about the issue of pit latrines around, for very young kids and the danger that poses. Another issue that I wanted to raise that Mom Colleen also spoke about is around the informality of the ECD sector. Now, one of the other stats that came up in the report was that only 35% of the ECD workforce is registered with a UIF. And some people were even saying that they think that figure is too high because in their experience, in their network, it's actually significantly lower. And the reason why I want to speak to this is the fact that, obviously there's a huge responsibility on the state around, doing what they can to improve the sector. But I think, the issue around UIF, I think it's something that the sector needs to also, needs to reflect on and think about how do they play a role in, bringing dignity to the ECD workforce, and how do employers who can register their staff for UIF really take, efforts towards this? Because I think, that figure could be substantially increased. And as I mentioned, the ECD sector has a responsibility to play in this regard. And I think the last point I want to make is really around the issue of local government. As an organization, we've been doing a lot of work around the issue of local government and how do we embed ECD within the local government space. And for me, it's very hard to talk about registration without talking about the issue of local government because, these are really complex issues that's fundamentally tied to local government. And I think, as we think beyond COVID as well, we need to start thinking about, how do we as organizations really focus a lot of our work in engaging with our respective municipalities to make sure that there's clear, systematic, and programmatic approach to ECDs that are the ECD service provisioning in their respective municipalities. And I really hope that, in the coming months, once this crisis has been, managed and we see at the end of it, that more organizations really take this local government baton up. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It looks like we might have lost Colleen, but we'll keep an eye on that and see if we can get her back. I see that there's a question. Oh, Colleen, are you there?
Sorry.
You are.
Sorry.
Not to worry. I wanted to start by asking if anything that any of the other panelists has said has triggered anything in you, if any one of you wants to speak to something that someone else said.
I just want to touch on what was said about working with local government in terms of registering the ECD sites. And I think that in terms of the Western Cape, I don't know how the other provinces work, But in the Western Cape, the city of Cape Town has started a process of a one-stop registration for ECD sites where they will be given a tracking number so that they can track how far the registration process is. But I think that the situation or the challenge is that when they have to rezone properties, something like 30,000 rand to be paid to rezone your property to operate from your home. And that is ridiculous because where do ECD practitioners or managers find this amount of money? The other challenge is, and when we try to work in the informal settlements of trying to assist to get them registered, I mean, there are ridiculous things, and I find myself repeating the same things over and over. And I'm not sure if anybody really takes note because one of the conditions in the shacks is that they must have a fire door. Now, really, a fire door is heavier than a shack. So, we need to look at the informal dwellings. Those children also need to be in ECD sites. I took an American group on a tour of the shack ECD sites. And we went into one of these sites, and one of the ladies said, you talk about wall-to-wall carpeting. Here we have wall-to-wall children. Because the need to have children in a safe place and to be stimulated is there. So my appeal is that government, local authorities, local municipalities, they really need to take hindsight and look at how do we assist the people that look after children in the informal settlements. How do we get them to meet some sort of a criteria that will assist them? In terms of UIF and all those other things, I think that most people are not capacitated in terms of running an organization, so they're not aware of the UIF, the tax, and all of those things that need to be paid. And this is very evident because I'm in 6 groups, ECD groups spread over South Africa, and most of them are asking, how do we register our site? Do we register it as a PBO, with SIPC, or a PTY, or as an NPO? So there's all of these challenges that are there. And I understand that the work is cut out for us to ensure that we make sure every ECD site is safe and secure for our children. But I think that the time has come when privilege needs to reach out to the poor, otherwise the gap is going to widen. I think that we need to rethink within ourselves, as Samia said, and I think that we need to look at what can we do differently. How do I become an active citizen and support a change in my community?
Thank you, Colleen.
Can I say something? So, I was just also reflecting, that is such a useful sort of thing to say, Colleen, really with the emphasis on the word rethink. When you were talking about the registration, Samia, I was just reflecting on, is there anything at all in the current system that can be improved? Or that, in fact, this is the opportunity to rethink the entire system. The system is based on a very different context. The fact that in order for you to start the registration process, you've got to either have title deeds to your home or use extended lease or permission to use that extend to a number of years. What proportion of the families in South Africa have title deeds in the informal shacks and in the informal areas? What proportion in the communities that themselves were not, it's communities of people who put themselves in a land or on a land that's not proclaimed? That means there is no chance at all whatsoever that anyone will get permission to put up an ECD facility in a community. At what point are we going to realize that South Africa is actually massively a third world country that is struggling to develop itself out of that reality. And that we have to see it, that there is no way that anyone can have a fire door in an informal community that is barely coping with the little space that's available for people who live there. And so I'm really making a case for this could very well be the time for us to rethink the entire system and move away from compliance that's based on standards that are not based on the reality of South Africa, and find a way of giving access to quality early learning and care for children, despite where they find themselves, despite the reality of the context of where they live.
I think that's a really important point, Grace. Sorry, Samia.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. I think, so the Vangasali project, it's a project that the Nelson Mandela Foundation is doing in conjunction with GovChat and the Department of Social Development. And the project is not right now we're in almost concluding phase 1 of the project, which is around finding every early childhood development service in the country, which not only includes ECD services, but other services in the country. And that's just one leg of the bigger project that has 2 other phases. And what we're busy doing now with the department is planning for the second phase that's aimed at trying to figure out at what level everybody is at, so as to be able to, rapidly increase registration. So people will be seeing a lot more in the next coming months. The department, I obviously can't speak on the department's behalf. I can only speak on, obviously on behalf of the Nelson Mandela Foundation. But it's really speaking to using this moment to rapidly increase registration. So that's definitely something that people are, that the department is alive to, and really about thinking about how to, make the conditional framework of, bronze, silver, and gold, of which I'm sure some people are aware of, to make that mainstream and part of the system. So that's very much on the agenda, I think, of government.
Thank you. I see that there's some interesting questions coming in, and I thought it would be a good opportunity to look at a couple of them. So Helene Visagie, Ashley, if you'd be able to put that question up. It says, it seems the issues of ECD has been ongoing and fall on deaf ears. Surely these will be severe consequences for the development of children if these issues aren't addressed in practical ways. And I think that speaks to the question of, we've spoken about the challenges in the ECD sector, we've spoken about the challenges for people who are running small businesses. But what do you think the consequences are going to be for children and for families in this moment? Grace, would you like to respond to that?
So the consequences are going to be dire. The consequences have already been dire. So you asking about what the consequences will be for children and their families right now during COVID-19. Is that what the question is? Well, we've already seen the consequences. We've seen how families have been really desperate for food. All families, we've seen that as one of the features of the coronavirus in our country. And children's vulnerability has just really escalated in that area. There were great attempts and continue to be in the sector with people who are quite aware of how much every week counts with regards to stimulation of children. And there's been really quite a lot of effort in people trying to get content down to families for children to continue to be stimulated. I'm just concerned that none of what we are doing is structural change that is sustained, that will get us a stronger, more solid ECD sector post this. And so that is what feels like it's missing, that this is the opportunity for us to really establish elements of a far more sustainable, stronger ECD sector post this time. You raised the issue of parents. The culture of education in South Africa is one where we struggle a lot to get parents involved as a partner in the education of their children throughout the education career. And, you know, it occurs to me in conversation with some colleagues during the week that, you know, with what has happened, one of the things that it has resulted in is almost give the power back to, as one of the colleagues said, give the power back to parents as educators of their children. ECD feels like that time when, if we really want to change the culture or influence the culture in any way, this is exactly the thing to build on. Parents have been sitting with their children, getting all kinds of support, you know, from a distance, but really driving the learning and education of their children. And really did occur that this is exactly the kind of culture we could be building on, that if we succeed, it will extend beyond the ECD years into later education years.
Thank you for that point. It speaks to a question which I had, which I'm going to come to, which is about what can we do in this moment that might help us, you know, beyond coronavirus. But before we get there, we had a question from David Jeffrey on the private chat. If you could put that question up, please, Ashley. So this was speaking to when you were speaking about the statistics about centers being worried about reopening, Samia. If you'd be able to respond to that question. Sorry, Samia.
Sorry, David, I answered your question if you didn't hear me. So what I'll do is I'll answer that question and then maybe give some stats, because maybe everyone didn't read the report. So that particular stat that David was asking about, we asked whether people were worried about reopening. So it was 68% of people were worried that they wouldn't be able to open once the lockdown ends. Some of the other stats in that report as well. So 99% of ECD operators reported that parents had stopped paying fees. So this was in April. People were already saying this. 83% of ECD operators said that they weren't able to pay the full salaries of staff members over the lockdown period. 96% of ECD operators were saying that their income wasn't enough to cover operating costs. And the rest of the stats really speak to the informality of the sector, speaking to UIF registration, SARS registration, and CIPC registration. And then, Colleen, if I could maybe just something that was mentioned earlier around UIF. So I think something we must all really, I think in the coming weeks, dedicate a lot of advocacy to is the Department of Labor were threatened with legal action from the Farm Workers, so Women on Farms Association, and the domestic and people within the domestic worker space to change their regulations so as to allow people who are not registered for UIF to get temporary unemployment relief from tiers. So the Department of Labor, they've gazetted changes to allow this, but the online applications seem to not have aligned with the gazette changes yet. So I think it's something that's going to be really important for the ECD sector to make sure that, you know, even though the reopening is taking place, people are still going to need support. And that's a really, you know, that's definitely a possible avenue that we can explore for relief for our ECD workforce.
Thank you for that. And just to be clear, when we say that ECD centers were worried that they wouldn't be able to reopen, do you mean that their businesses would fail before that, or that they wouldn't be able to that their businesses would fail? Yeah. So it really is a very dire situation that we're in. So I see that we had another question. Could you pull that one up again, Ash? From Yoga of Elements. So what are the main requirements for being able to open ECD centers during this time? Sorry, just joining now. Not sure if this was discussed already. So yes, it's it's not clear to all of us exactly what the requirements are yet, but I don't know if, Colleen, if you'd like to answer that question.
I think that currently the discussions with GSD has been that no ECD sites should open now. We also need to look at the fact that when our children do go back to the ECD sites, it's going to be a phased-in process as well. But I think that I also look at the way we do our registration of our ECD sites, and I'm always of the opinion that even before somebody opens an ECD site, they should meet the requirements of the Child Protection Register and the National Sexual Offenders Register, because those are two criteria in the Children's Act, which says that anybody that works or integrates with children should be cleared on those two registers. Now you have people, and this is also where the Children's Act, I feel, comes in. We have 6 children that can be looked after by a day mother, but it doesn't allow for the fact that she possibly has 2 or 3 of her children from her family members, so that makes 9 children. Nobody checks on that, and I'm always saying that that is also opening a gap, because there's no screening processes for the day mother. And so what are we subjecting our children to? And we've always advocated that that needs to come out of the Children's Act. The fact that somebody can look after 6 children without being evaluated, without registering as a day mother or play group, that needs to come out. So I think currently what is happening is that DSD is not allowing any new ECD sites to open, because as Samia said, the Vangalasi program is to track every ECD site, and I think that is a huge challenge on its own, and that maybe this is where community should come into work and support those ECD sites that are not registered. Because at the same time, there are people who are scared to give their name for the Vangasali project, because they're saying that they've been threatened, they will be forced to close. And I think that we have too many people giving information in the communities that are not valid, and this also puts fear in the ECD communities. And I'm saying this because these are discussions that happens in the groups that we're talking about. I see Rebecca's also mentioned the fact about the SOPs that I addressed earlier in her comments, saying that how do we get people in the poor communities to download a 69-page document? And I thought I would leave that as a topic for another day. But I think that when the work streams worked, I don't think that we wanted this docket to be such a burden for somebody to read. We wanted it to be a user-friendly document that people could identify with and see how do they implement it at the ECD sites. Thank you.
Thank you, Colleen. Thanks, Samia.
Yeah, if I could also maybe come in here, I think I also understood that question to also just be a question around process. I'm not sure if I misunderstood it, so maybe just for everyone's benefit. So, and I know the other colleagues can also come in here. So in terms of process, the DSD obviously released their circular, and then attached to that is Form 1 that they're encouraging people to fill in online if possible. And if you can't fill that out online, then there's a paper-based version that you can submit at your local service office. And that is a pre-assessment form. That form has 2 parts. So the majority of that form is a pre-assessment form to really get a sense of whether sites are ready. That information is going to be given to provinces, where provinces will do on-site verification to a select number of sites. Obviously, they can't go to everyone, to check whether, in fact, the sites that have said that they are ready to open, whether they are, in fact, ready to open. And this is really important because at the end of the day, DSD, as a department, they're responsible for making sure that the sector safely reopens, and that information will give them a sense of, when the sector can safely open. As part of Form 1, the second part of Form 1, which is just towards the end, is a support application. So people who need support, you can fill out that part of that's why I encourage you to fill out the Form 1 online, because it will be a more easier way for the department to get your information. So if you are in need of support, you can put your information there, and on the provincial level, there'll be, if you are applicable for support, you will be getting that support. I think Ma'am Colleen asked the question earlier about who is going to be getting the support. It's going to be prioritized to if you are located in a poor community. That's going to be like quite a significant, and you'll see it there. It's like one of the questions that's asked, also around water access and that kind of thing, because water is obviously really important, especially around issues of sanitation and the current pandemic. The standard operating procedures has also been released So you'll get a sense of the kind of things in more detail that you need in place pre-opening, and also once you open, in terms of, how do you manage kids, how do you manage them coming to your sites and that kind of thing. And then also once site open, there'll be, once the verification phase is done, there'll be on-site monitoring. So, you might get a drop in from your provincial, representative or any other government official, or you might get NGOs coming to do these site visits. But these site visits by NGOs would be NGOs that, have worked through government, and government is almost giving them, some sort of permission to say, please, can you go to these sites to do on-site monitoring? So I'm hoping that covers that question.
Thank you. I think that was a very thorough explanation. Thank you, Samia. Ash, could you put the Louise's question and then Renee's question on the screen? I thought these questions would be best handled together. So basically, I think this is a question of, it seems like part of the problem in the ECD sector is the fragmentation. There are a number of ECD forums, and some of them are quite large, and other sort of aggregated service providers. But I think this question of how we speak with a united voice is one of them, is a question that we need to think about. And then, are there any forums through which government can receive feedback on these issues? Because we've seen that some of the issues that we've noted, government may benefit from hearing from the sector. So maybe, Samia, if you have any thoughts on those two, and then I'll also maybe ask Grace as well.
Apologies, do you mind repeating the first question? I'm sorry about that.
Sure. So how can the ECD sector speak with a united voice? To what extent is that currently possible?
I think it's very possible. I think this is a moment that we can use to bring the ECD sector together. I think it's really important that question around unity, especially because children don't have the ability to protest the way that students do in university, and so they almost, that's why the moral responsibility on us is so great, because we almost have to act on behalf of these kids who can't speak on their behalf. So yeah, I think it's it's something that's really important, and I think it's just trying to figure out what does that unity look like. How do we strengthen, particularly, we work with a lot of ECD forums, and it's such an important community structure, and but it's a community structure that often people ignore, or don't really invest a lot of resources in it. It's like, how do we have this, like, really, in our quest to unify, how do we make sure that, we're bringing together the people that are on a grassroots level? Because it's no point that, the big organizations or well-resourced organizations come together and we call that unifying. Unifying is really when we bring together grassroots organizations as well, strengthen them, and to make sure that they really have a voice around policy. And then the second question from Renee. Hi, Renee. Sorry, the question was around
are there any forums through which government can receive feedback on these issues?
I'm not sure in terms of formal process, but I think this is a time where I think a lot of government departments are, taking calls, taking emails. So it's really about, how do you use every channel that's available? Because I think these kind of like formal structures have, in a way, in this COVID period, have melted away a bit. And so it's almost made a lot of these government departments a lot more flat, in maybe ways that we haven't seen before. So yeah, I think that's just some comments from me.
Yeah, and Grace, would you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I agree completely with Samia. I think solidarity. So when we talk about solidarity in terms of serious epidemics like this, I think it applies exactly the same way in our sector. And absolutely right. I completely think that solidarity has got to be found at all levels of interest in the ECD fraternity. If people on the ground were able to unite, and people have the ability, we've seen in our country, we have that ability, to unite around common issues, rather than, in the context of massive constraints. What could be more evident is divisions rather than unity, as we perceive ourselves challenge around shrinking resources, but big need that we all facing. And in the same way, I think at a national level, I feel like the opportunities of the last few weeks interacting as a sector with government around the reopening. Whatever the outcome is, I do think that the outcome of a 60-page dossier that has to somehow find its way to a rural area that is struggling with network connectivity is a little bit of a challenge. But be that as it may, I feel like the processes that have been happening in the last few weeks of interacting with government and the civil society organizations and problem solving around reopening really presents us with a strong opportunity to build on moving forward, you know, where we hold each other accountable, that there isn't one that is more accountable than the other. Because in fact, as we were describing in the beginning, the social sector really is carrying the burden of ECD in South Africa. It's a major role player. The NGO sector is, ECD providers, operators on the ground are depending so much on the support, the training and development. And in this period, even the transitioning into reopening by the NGO sector, organizations themselves that are very, very fragile because they depend on private funding for their survival. So, there's a lot that brings us together, and there's a lot that we can build on from this period of crisis. That we have one voice, and that we can be a sector to be reckoned with.
Thank you. Colleen, in your experience running, the Mitchell Plain Education Forum, how has it been? What channels exist for communication with governments in your experience?
Okay, basically that is an organization that covers from ECD to tertiary education, but most of our work was done in schools where there were no not sufficient schools or children not placed in schools. So that is something that I don't really think impacts. But I do want to agree with what Grace is saying, that this is an opportunity for us to work together. Although I always claim to be a realist, I always look at a bigger picture. And even although I'm in various organizations and forums, and I chair some ECD forums which are city related, I find that I need to be very careful how I bridge this because I don't want to open another can of worms. But I find that the racial issue is still very prevalent in our ECD sector. Even although we're uniting in terms of what we're doing, there are always some people that would pass comments in terms of, why would you want to help that person? And I just feel that, as I've said at the beginning, we need to start doing introspection of ourselves. We're working with children. We cannot have biases because we're working with a future generation. And if our teachers, our practitioners, and our managers have biases towards children of color, then they shouldn't be in this ECD sector. And one of my other passions is that I always believe every child has a right to an ECD environment. So I'm also about inclusion. At my ECD site, we include children with barriers to learning as well. So yes, this is the time to unite, a time to do inward reflections and start getting rid of the biases that we have to pave the way forward for our children.
Sorry, Samia, you had a point you were going to make.
Yes, no, I think there's something Mom Colleen said I think is really important, as we talk about using this time as a mirror for ourselves and for the sector, especially, in the current climate of Black Lives Matter and talking about how do we as countries and institutions think about transformation. I think we really need to hold up a mirror for ourselves in this regard. I get it's really upsetting and disconcerting when, on the one hand, we have a situation where the majority of the ECD sector on the ground in terms of practitioner profile are significantly Black women. But when you go on the upper echelons of NGOs and many NGOs in the ECD sector, that's not reflected in terms of the leadership. So you go to many meetings and it's predominantly white. And I think it's really important that our boardrooms and our organizations and the leadership must reflect what the sector looks like, and it must reflect the country's demographics. And I think that's something that we really need to take seriously.
Thank you for that point. Yeah, so I think one of the questions coming in on the chat group is around, I guess, the practicalities of what life will look like in COVID as centers are starting to open up. We've got parents who, going to be dropping their children off at centers. There we go. How do we have to take temperature when they drop kids off? Can the parents come to school, or do they have to fetch their children at the gate? I guess one set of thinking is like, what does the ECD sector look like in COVID times if they do start to reopen?
Can I answer on that?
Yeah.
Because just in terms of the SOP, it very clearly states in terms of how parents should bring their children to the ECD site. And it states there that parents are not allowed beyond the entrance gate because questions need to be asked to the parent regarding the child. There's a range of questions, and temperatures need to be taken of the child and the parent. And then the teacher needs to escort the child to the classroom. So I think that a lot also depends on the support of parents. And I think one of the issues in the SOP is that managers of ECD sites need to communicate to parents how the system is going to work and what support can they give, because we cannot have parents coming onto the ECD site or any visitors without the mask. And I think that's very clearly stated in the SOP in terms of that.
And what does a normal day in an ECD center look like during COVID, Colleen? Like, what would be different for children and for parents in their day-to-day experiences?
A normal day would be children coming in, hugging their friends, hugging the teachers, parents engaging with staff, engaging with each other, chatting. It's just the way that the ECD site is. I would always say that there's so much love flowing. It's going to be different. I'm actually very worried how we're going to do it, because children are naturally social beings, and how are we going to practice physical distancing with them in terms of the new normal? And so it's a worrying factor, and I think parents are also worried about the fact that how are we going to manage their children. But I think that we have innovative teachers that are very creative, and they will find ways of carrying out the program in a way that's effective in terms of physical distancing and all the other issues in terms of COVID compliance.
I was listening to something earlier today which struck me, which was where the speaker was saying that having to convey to young children that other children are threats, that they're not allowed to spend time with them or to come into contact with them, is quite a intense thing to say to a young child. To teach them to be physically distant from other people isn't really the world that we want to be bringing them into.
It's very challenging because I haven't seen my grandchildren since the 18th of March. And today my son said, "Mom, just come onto the stoep." And they were in the car. I couldn't even hug him. So it's going to be a challenge. And he kept saying, "Mom, hug me." And I explained to him, that it's different. I said, maybe when it's my birthday, you can come and hug me. But the challenges are real. And I mean, how are we going to deal with it? Because when the children come in, they run and hug and kiss me and they talk about me. And that's just the way that the children are. So it's very, very difficult. But we'll overcome it, I'm sure.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's really important, as we think about the statistics and the scale of the problem, also to keep in touch with the very human stories. and the fact that this is really about individual children, individual teachers, individual principals, and how they can navigate through this system. So Helene has asked, do you think that we need to wait for the peak to pass before reopening ECD centers? Does anybody want to speak to that question? Grace?
Yeah, I mean, we're not dealing with easy questions here, right? The only comfort is that ECD is right there as part of real life all over around us in our country, so it's not different. We have to figure out ways to manage. We're already sitting with quite a challenged sector. So when we think about this, we really do need to find a balance between health and not be immobilized by the risk, but find ways to learn and manage our way out of it by learning ways of coping with it. And my view is that we actually have got to reopen. It's a little bit of a contradiction that this is a sector that is largely private in nature, and their reopening is being controlled from outside, not from within the center. What you can do is allow them to open, and they will decide with proper information around how safe is it to reopen in this community under these circumstances with this profile of practitioners. So we know, just like in any other sector, that older people are at higher risk of being seriously ill. We just need to manage that kind of thing, encourage people who are older and much more at risk, perhaps not to open immediately until there's a little bit more certainty around the dynamics. So my view is that forcing the center to remain, the sector to remain closed is counterproductive. But not taking control from them to decide when they can, if they can. That's my view.
I think that's a really helpful framing, Grace. Something that I've been thinking recently, because this discussion has been happening in the education sector as well. And I think the key difference between ECD and education is that when the Department of Education says schools need to reopen, they're in a sense forcing teachers to return to school. And some of those teachers may be at risk. And I think that's the question that we have to grapple with. But when the Department of Social Development says to ECD centers that they cannot reopen, they're also in a sense depriving principals and teachers of the choice and the ability to make those choices themselves. And I think that's a critical distinction that we need to make when we're thinking about these big problems, I guess.
Yeah.
So we have a couple of more questions on the chat group. Let me quickly navigate to them. So Ashley has asked, Ashley, is that a question from the group? Will ECD practitioners be safer than basic ed practitioners, given that some teachers are calling for schools to be closed? That's from Ashley. Colleen, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
I think that the reality is that COVID is here and it's going to be with us for a very long time. I also think that people that are at high risk would practice the precautions. I mean, I'm high risk, so I don't have visitors at my home. I stay indoors and I try to practice the measures that are necessary to ensure that my well-being is healthy. I think that a lot would depend. I mean, I know the schools are in dire crisis currently. And my biggest concern is the fact that we have all these children going back on the 6th of July, and we do not have sufficient classrooms to accommodate the physical distancing. I mean, I was in a webinar the other night where a student said they have 3 matric classes and they're now using 6 classes. So when the other children come back, how are they going to work around that? No classrooms were built, no extra prefabs were dropped at schools or anything like that. So I think that we need to manage how we're going to work around this, because we cannot stay in lockdown forever. We have to go out and life needs to carry on. And so we need to ensure that everybody has the opportunity to make a decision as to how and what they're going to do. I've made the decision that I will not go back to my center until September. I have a very big center, but I have very competent staff and very competent managers that will manage it for me in terms of me directing them from my home. So I think that choices need to be given to people. And at the end of the day, one needs to make it. I understand that parents are fearful, but every day I get parents asking me, when are you going to open? I need to go back. My child's left unsupervised. My child's left with somebody that I don't trust. I need my child to be back at the ECD site. So while we are going to experience all these challenges of ensuring that the children are safe, ensuring that the staff is safe, ensuring that parents are safe, I think that, as the president said, it's in our hands. I think that what's very scary is that the Western Cape is really peaking at the moment. And I don't want to make it a political thing, but that is what happens when politics play a role in terms of where the deaths are, where the hotspots are. And so I think basically it depends entirely on each individual to take responsibility for themselves, and that they need to realize this virus is real, it's not a joke. And they need to practice the precautions as given, wearing the mask, social distancing, and avoid going out if it's not necessary.
Thank you, Colleen. I'm hearing you saying that we need to trust people, but also that we need to provide them with support in order to help them to navigate this moment as well. I see that there's a question about from Stephanie about NGOs and food provision. If you could put that on the screen, please, Ash. So do you think there is interest from NGOs involved in food provision to form long-lasting links, particularly with unregistered ECD, to improve child nutrition? That's a good question, and I'm not sure who is best to respond to that. Margrace, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I can only share my view, and I think there is interest. One thing that we have all realized is just how food insecure children in South Africa, and from what Samia was describing of the big proportion of the ECD workforce themselves being in the informal sector, the level of food insecurity is unbelievable in our country. And I think that everyone that has had anything to do with it in the last 3 months, as we are all finding ways to respond to the challenge, does realize that as we move forward out of this crisis and shape a really changed future with a post-lockdown reopening, there is real interest of integrating nutrition in our programs. And so what really is required is the ECD the marrying of the provider of ECD with the food provider, so that there really, I don't know what I did, I just mute myself. That as the Bangasali campaign says, that we make sure that we don't leave any child behind, with access to learning, access to good nutrition, and support for their parents and the NGO network that's supporting them.
And then if I could maybe come in here and then add a point, and this is just an anecdotal story. I was doing site visits in rural KZN and the Eastern Cape. And some of the villages that we went to, the same stories were coming up, where you'd speak to ECD centers in these communities, and they were saying that we were asking them about, do all these kids in the areas access these ECD centers? And they were saying that there's a lot of children who are at home, and the reason why they don't come to the ECD service is because these these centers are unfunded. Children have to come with their lunch to school, And because in those rural areas, kids only have breakfast and supper, and families don't have food to send for lunch, that's actually the barrier as to why kids don't access those ECD learning centers. So, I think it comes back to the issue around registration and that subsidy, but even beyond that, to that particular question around the role of food providers. And, there are a lot of food providers that prioritize unregistered ECD services, but obviously they don't, the scale of the problem is obviously, bigger than what they are able to provide.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And yeah, I mean, for me, this question of registration, it's such a difficult one because partly it's around, the difficulty of some centers getting registered and, the particular barriers to registration. But the other thing is also the budgets around ECD, because even of the registered centers, not all centers are receiving subsidies. And so politically, it seems like there's a bit of a barrier to ECD receiving the funding that is required for, as you say, those children to be receiving lunch at their centers. It doesn't seem that in terms of political priorities in South Africa at the moment, that there is a sufficient emphasis on the value of good quality early childhood development. I don't know if anybody would disagree with that. Grace, you look like you're...
Yeah, I don't disagree. I just, so when the crisis hit, the crisis of the pandemic hit South Africa, the president found 500 billion rand to support the country. So the point I'm making is that all we require is just a little bit more will. And we're talking about what it really is fundamental children's rights here, to care and education and food and everything. And that, I think before we look at, you're being absolutely pragmatic and it's right. I mean, we are unlikely to suddenly see money pop up in the budget and enable the things that it should be enabling. But that if we cut it slack, there isn't going to be an opportunity to just make it happen. In the same way that the billion rand managed to get into the hands of the taxi industry, rightfully, there has got to be, a shift that says children really are important. And we know that this service makes such a big difference to lifelong learning and success. Why are we giving it such little support? Why are we undervaluing it so much? So pragmatically, I agree that budgets are a challenge. At some point, we've got to see that really we are a country that values its children, as Mr. Mandela said a long time ago. Do you know what I mean?
Can I just add something? Oh.
Yeah, you go ahead.
I think that I would agree with what Grace is saying, but also at the same time, we've never had political will behind early childhood development. And I think in the last few years, there's been the first 2,000 days as critical, and I think government has also launched the fact that children in the 0 to 4 year category is very important. But that was as far as it went. There's never been the political will to drive it. And I'm saying that research has shown that children who are in early childhood development centers are less likely to join gangsters, are less likely to have teenage pregnancies, and they go on to become lifelong learners. So why are we not investing in our children? Is it because, as Samia said, they don't have a voice? It's that adults are fighting for them. But I think at the time, and I really would love to believe that during this period, government would really look at seriously intervening in terms of early childhood development, because they are our future. And I think that it impacts on the economy, because if we have children not falling prone to gangsterism or substance abuse, there's less impact on the state's coffers when they need to go into rehabilitation centers. I think Eric's favorite is that it costs 400 rand to keep a prisoner in jail, and it costs them here 200 or 120 to keep a child in an ECD site. So if we turn that around and invest in early childhood development, maybe we would have less prisoners in the jails.
Yeah.
Samia, I know you wanted to add something.
Yes. Can I just check first? Can you hear me properly? Sorry.
Yes.
Sorry about. Okay, great. Okay, thanks so much. I think just two things on the question around budgeting. I think there is a need to conscientize public officials around the importance of early childhood development. I remember I spoke to someone in DPME, and they were saying that they were in a meeting once where a government official said, "Yeah, but don't kids only start learning like when they're 2 years old or something?" And so there's like at a public official level, there's a real need to. I think we take it for granted when we have that throwaway line that ECD is important, etc. But like really, sitting and trying to unpack the importance of brain development during that phase. So that's one thing. And I think the other is that I think it is very hard to make the case to Treasury around prioritizing more funding for the sector when we don't know what the scale of unregistered ECD centers are. Some people say 30,000, 40,000, 60,000. I mean, that's a huge range that we're working with. So, that's why the issue of data is so important. So that's really, that's why we try and encourage participation in the Vangasali campaign. And I hope in the coming months, through these various processes that government is doing, through these self-assessments, through everything, all these other processes, that we do get better information around the scale of unregistered, because that will really help to make the case, especially with around zero budgeting that government is trying to look at now in the next while.
And if I can throw that to you, Grace, as well, I know that Smart Start are also very aware that not just children in ECD centers should be receiving support.
Yes, I was going to find a way to make that point. The ECD sector is very, very fragile. It's very, very fragile. We've seen just how the COVID-19 crisis has exposed that fragility. I just really want to say there is another 1 million children out there, just the ones between the ages of 3 and 5. They are even more fragile because they do not even access ECD. I'm just saying the strategy that works is one that will continue to open the net into registration for the unregistered centers. It is crucial. It's crucial. It's not sustainable, the situation we're in. I mean, all we're doing is perpetuating inequality if we go on like this. But at the same time, we've got to find creative ways to get children who are going to start grade 1 without any benefit of quality stimulation whatsoever. So as we think about budgets and the counting, the real data that Samia is talking about, that is just, you just can't overemphasize the importance of getting the right information. We really do need to make sure that we do not lose sight of the children who, right now, as to Colleen's point, or maybe you didn't make the point directly, right now, the bulk of that population of children are the poorest children because their parents just can't afford to pay a private service without government support. That's the crisis we're dealing with in South Africa. And, one side of the problem is not more important than the other. The only way that we're going to get a stable ECD sector is if really we manage to keep sight of the child at the center of this, an empowered workforce and enabling delivery of quality ECD in South Africa.
And I think it would be remiss if we didn't add, that although obviously the discussion around ECD services are important, no one can really replace the role that parents have to play and families and primary caregivers. and that, while we want to have a very strong ECD service sector, the role of families are invaluable, and we must never speak about ECD services in a way that undermine that role, but really just think about how do we, in this process of making people understand ECD, that we strengthen families' confidence and their knowledge around ECD.
Yeah.
That's valuable.
I think that's a very important that Samia has raised as well, that we need to include our families and our communities. Very, very critical point.
Yeah, I agree. I want to, because we're almost at our time limit, I wanted to quickly ask, because we've dealt with a whole range of issues, and this is such a difficult time, and it has such deep and personal consequences for so many people. Just to sort of elevate the conversation and to dream a little bit, Grace has already spoken a bit about what can we do now to re-envision the sector that will benefit us going forward. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to think, if you were the Minister of the Department of Social Development tomorrow, what would you focus on? Where are you excited? So maybe Colleen, if you have any thoughts to start us. Okay, I don't want to put you on the spot.
Okay, Chairman, I just see there's a lady, Kaylee Combing, that's asking many, many questions. And if we can just settle her fears and all of that.
Let's do that.
Kaylee, I think that what you're asking would be dependent on the ECD site, because everybody would manage how they're going to work it. So I'm afraid I cannot give you a definite answer in terms of how are the children going to be kept apart, how are they going to come in the mornings or the afternoons, etc. That would depend entirely on the ECD site and the context in which they work. I trust that allays some of your fears that you have.
Thank you for answering that question, Colleen. Yeah, so to think and dream a little, what would you focus on if you were the minister? I don't know, Samia, if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah. I wish I had a super ministry, and that I was the minister of both Department of Social Development and COGTA, because I think although the Children's Act doesn't really speak to local government, the integrated policy carves out quite a strong role for local municipalities and for COGTA that I think that sometimes gets overlooked. So if I was the super minister of both these ministries, I would make sure that municipalities, district municipalities and your metros have clear 5-year plans in line with the integrated policy, and that they integrate their planning on a municipal level with the province planning, so that both those spheres of government are not doing different things, that there's proper population planning, so we understand in a municipality, these are the kids that are getting the services, this is what the deficit is, this is how we need to be directing our IDP and the MIG infrastructure grants towards filling this access deficit. This is how we can use our existing facilities to make available to other ECD service provisions. I would also make sure that there's the integrated policy also speaks about the need for coordinating structures at a municipal level to do all that planning, and also make sure that that would be in place. So those would be the two things of my super ministry that I'd like to do.
And I love how that fits so well with your role as an analyst. But I think very, very astute points that you've made there. Grace, do you have any thoughts on this? I think your mic is still muted, Grace.
Yeah, sorry. As Samia was talking, I was sort of wondering, what I could improve on that. And,
Grace, you can also have your own super ministry. So you can have a super ministry, we can all have our own super ministries. Okay.
Everyone gets a super ministry. But honestly, I think that one of the biggest opportunity that feels to me like a coordinated opportunity is the district development model, where, I mean, children live there. So I have no idea what will come out of it, but it feels to me like you've got elements in ECD that have to do with small business, education outcomes, got health outcomes, you've got child protection and child rights, and you've got local government support where everything comes together. So it feels to me like it's that kind. You need a super, so that the workforce is not excluded from higher education and higher education opportunities, that the operators are not excluded from recognition and support as small businesses that have the ambition to grow into even bigger and do. They are a very ambitious group of people with great capacities and so on. So I'm drawn to Samia's model. I just would pull all of the other, the health aspects, the nutrition aspects, all of that into the super ministry.
Wonderful. And Colleen, do you have anything?
Okay, I was asked the very same question last week, and I think that I have a dream which is not going to happen soon. So I think Samia and Grace has really shed what I feel, and I would really like to work in Samia's ministry and support her to make sure that whatever she plans happens for our children. I think it's important that our children are in best practice ECD sites, but I think also that when we talk about our children, we don't talk about our children at birth, we talk about prenatal. So I think that we also need to be having educational talks with pregnant mummies as well. And I would support those two ladies. I think the three of us would make a formidable team to ensure that all our children in South Africa is in the best practice ECD site. Samia is an analyst, so I think she's very good at what she does. I'm just the ECD teacher.
There's been a change in regulations that independent candidates can run for election. So I think there's hope for us.
Okay, are you standing for the next election, Samia? You have my vote.
Yeah, I wanted to say, and I think I hope that I speak partly on behalf of the people watching as well, that we're very grateful that the sector is in the hands of people like yourselves. I personally have found this very stimulating and engaging and thought-provoking. I think it's really important that we have really high caliber leadership in the sector at the moment. I can tell that there is that leadership, at multiple different levels in the sector. And really, this is a sector that has drawn a lot of really talented and passionate people into it. And it's wonderful to see how that is working in all the different spaces that it is working. So really, from myself, also from my team, I wanted to say thank you guys so much for agreeing to spend this time together, to think together, to help cast a little bit of light for the people who are watching as well. I wanted to just quickly also recognize my team members behind the scenes. They're not visible today, but they're all there. So we've got Ashley Visachi, who's been handling the chat and the technical side of things. Also Helene Visachi, his wife, who's also been assisting in the background, and then Renee McFarlane, who are all part of the Fish Tank, who've been helping to put this talk together. We'll be organizing more of these events in future. But it was really wonderful to spend this time together, and thank you guys so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us.
And thank you to the people at home who tuned in. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.